A gavel's weight. In the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, the grand courtroom of Fulton County stood imposing and unyielding. Its polished wooden benches gleamed under the weight of fluorescent lights, and the air hummed with tension that words could not dispel. The case of Marcus Tillman, a 25-year-old African-American man accused of a heinous crime, had gripped the nation. News crews swarmed outside, while inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Judge Nathaniel Grant, a towering figure in the judiciary system with over 4 decades on the bench, adjusted his robes as he entered the room. Known for his iron-fisted rulings, Grant had built his career on being decisive and unyielding, often hailed as a symbol of justice uncompromised. But today, something gnawed at him, a subtle unease he couldn't shake. Marcus stood at the defense table, his wrists bound in handcuffs that seemed far too heavy for a man of his lean build. His eyes, dark and resolute, held an unwavering determination, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him. His public defender, Susan Avery, whispered last-minute reassurances, though her voice trembled. She was a young, underfunded attorney battling seasoned prosecutors with a mountain of resources. The crime was brutal, a double homicide at a high-end clothing store in downtown Atlanta. 2 employees were gunned down during what authorities claimed was a botched robbery. Surveillance footage from outside the store showed a man fleeing the scene, and an anonymous tip led police to Marcus's apartment, where they claimed to find incriminating evidence. Marcus had pleaded not guilty from the start, insisting he had been at his job across town during the crime. The trial had been a whirlwind of damning evidence. The prosecution leaned heavily on the grainy surveillance footage, eyewitness testimony, and the discovery of a gun in Marcus's possession, a weapon they claimed matched the murder weapon. "I was framed," Marcus had said during his testimony, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. "I've never been in that store. I didn't do this." His alibi rested on a shaky foundation. Though Marcus insisted he was working a shift at a local diner, his manager could only confirm part of the day, leaving a gap in the timeline. The prosecution exploited this relentlessly, painting him as a cunning criminal who had carefully planned the crime. Judge Grant had heard it all before: tearful pleas, proclamations of innocence. They were nothing new. But there was something about Marcus that gave him pause, though he buried it beneath layers of judicial impartiality. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, the foreperson's expression was inscrutable. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that thickened the air, making it hard to breathe. Judge Grant adjusted his glasses, his face a mask of professionalism. "Have you reached a verdict?" he asked, his deep voice echoing. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, her voice steady yet heavy with the weight of their decision. As the words "guilty on all counts" rang through the courtroom, Marcus closed his eyes, his head bowing slightly. His mother, seated in the gallery, let out a quiet wail, clutching her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. Judge Grant's face remained stoic. He signaled for order as murmurs filled the room. This was not the first time he had witnessed such heartbreak. But why, then, did his chest tighten? The sentencing was swift. Judge Grant's words were as cold and deliberate as ever. "Marcus Tillman, for the crimes of armed robbery and first-degree murder, you are hereby sentenced to 60 years in a state correctional facility, without the possibility of parole." The gavel fell with a resounding thud, sealing Marcus's fate. A wave of emotions swept through the courtroom. Sorrow from his family, satisfaction from the victim's loved ones, and the reporters' feverish energy as they rushed to file their stories. Marcus was led away, his head held high despite the shackles that bound him. As he glanced back at his mother, the smallest flicker of a smile crossed his lips, a silent promise that this was not the end. Judge Grant retreated to his chambers, but the day lingered in his mind. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling like the questions that now stirred. Something about this case didn't sit right, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the rushed timeline, or the inconsistencies in Marcus's demeanor, defiant yet calm, even as the evidence mounted. No, Grant muttered to himself. The system worked. Justice was served. But even as he said the words aloud, they felt hollow. Weeks turned into months, but the Marcus Tillman case refused to fade from Judge Grant's mind. It didn't help that whispers of police misconduct began to surface, rumors that evidence had been tampered with and witnesses coerced. Grant dismissed them as baseless, the grumblings of conspiracy theorists. One evening, as he sifted through a backlog of case files, he came across a report from a separate investigation, a drug bust that happened just days after the murders. It was a routine review, but something caught his attention. The chain of custody for a firearm seized during the operation. The serial number matched the murder weapon in Marcus Tillman's case. Grant sat back, his hand trembling slightly as he reread the document. If the gun had been in police custody during the murders, how could it have been found in Marcus's possession? This can't be right, he whispered. But the sinking feeling in his gut told him otherwise. Unable to ignore his growing doubts, Grant began to dig deeper. He reviewed court transcripts, police reports, and forensic analyses. The deeper he went, the more inconsistencies he found. Witness testimonies didn't align with the physical evidence. Surveillance footage timestamps conflicted with the prosecution's timeline. And then there was the anonymous tip that led to Marcus's arrest, untraceable, originating from a burner phone. It became clear to Judge Grant something was wrong. This isn't justice, he muttered, his voice shaking. This is a cover-up. Determined to uncover the truth, Grant knew he was venturing into dangerous territory. The system he had dedicated his life to upholding now stood on shaky ground. But one thought drove him forward. Marcus Tillman could be an innocent man, and if he was, Grant had failed him. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a fight for redemption. A trail of shadows. Judge Grant's unease grew stronger each day. The whispers of police misconduct were no longer just a rumor. They were threads pulling at the fabric of the case. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus Tillman's resolute gaze as the sentence was handed down. A man wrongly accused wouldn't crumble, but he would stand firm, as Marcus had. It began with the gun. The serial number was a glaring inconsistency, but Judge Grant knew he needed more. He spent late nights poring over every scrap of evidence, every statement, and every transcript from the trial. His office, usually a sanctuary of order, became a battlefield of papers, files, and photographs. One night, Grant pulled out the police report detailing the chain of custody for the weapon. It listed Detective Harvey Trent as the officer who had seized the gun during a drug raid just days before the murders. Trent had been a key figure in Marcus's case, testifying that the weapon had been found in Marcus's apartment. How could the same gun have been in two places at once? Harvey Trent, Grant muttered under his breath. He remembered the detective well. Charming, confident, and persuasive on the stand. Too persuasive, perhaps. Grant felt the first pang of doubt in his own judgment. Had he been swayed by a showman rather than evidence? Grant's search led him to the precinct where Trent worked. Under the guise of preparing for another case, he requested access to archived police reports and evidence logs. The officer at the desk hesitated, his gaze narrowing. "You sure you want to dig into old files, Your Honor? These cases are closed." Grant's voice was firm. "I'm following up on some inconsistencies. I need to be thorough." The officer reluctantly handed over the files, and Grant spent hours in the precinct's dimly lit archive room. The air smelled of dust and old paper, but the files told a vivid story. Patterns emerged. Cases where evidence conveniently aligned with Trent's narrative, witnesses who changed their statements after initial interviews, and timelines that felt too neatly wrapped. As he flipped through a folder, a name jumped out. Paul Rodriguez. The man had been arrested during the same drug raid where the weapon had been seized. Grant jotted down the name and address, his instincts telling him this lead might unravel the truth. Paul Rodriguez lived in a rundown apartment complex on the edge of the city. The building's exterior was cracked and peeling, its windows dimly lit. Grant knocked on the door, his heart pounding. A grizzled man in his 50s answered, his eyes bloodshot and wary. "I'm Judge Nathaniel Grant," he began, showing his credentials. "I'm looking into a case involving Detective Trent, and your name came up. May I come in?" Rodriguez hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment was cluttered but clean, with a faint smell of tobacco hanging in the air. "What do you want with me?" Rodriguez asked, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. Grant sat on the worn-out couch, his voice steady. "I need to know about the night of your arrest. The gun that was seized. Can you tell me anything about it?" Rodriguez exhaled a long plume of smoke, his eyes narrowing. "You mean the one they said was mine? That wasn't my gun. I told them that." "Who's them?" "Trent and his partner. They roughed me up, said if I didn't cooperate, they'd make things worse. Next thing I know, they're saying I had a weapon on me. I never saw that gun before that night." Grant felt a chill run down his spine. "Why didn't you speak up during your trial?" Rodriguez laughed bitterly. "Against Trent? You kidding me? He owns the system. You don't fight someone like him, unless you want to end up dead or locked up longer." The pieces were falling into place, but Grant needed more. He reached out to Susan Avery, Marcus Tillman's defense attorney. They'd met in a quiet coffee shop, away from prying eyes. Avery looked exhausted, her face lined with stress. "I fought as hard as I could, Your Honor, but I didn't have the resources. The prosecution buried us in evidence, and every time I tried to poke holes, they slammed the door." "What about Trent?" Grant asked. "Did you notice anything unusual about his testimony?" Avery nodded. "It felt rehearsed, like he knew exactly what to say to shut me down. I suspected he was lying, but I couldn't prove it. The surveillance footage and the gun, they were too strong." Grant leaned forward. "What if I told you the gun was seized days before the murder, and that Trent might have planted it?" Avery's eyes widened. "If you can prove that, we have a chance to reopen the case, but going after Trent, that's dangerous territory." Grant's resolve hardened. Marcus deserves the truth, no matter the cost. The next step was the surveillance footage. Grant contacted a retired forensic analyst, Peter Holloway, who specialized in digital forensics. Holloway was skeptical at first, but agreed to review the footage. Days later, he called Grant with his findings. The footage was tampered with. The timestamps don't align with the metadata. Someone altered the video to make it look like Marcus was near the store. Grant's chest tightened. "Can you trace who made the alterations?" Holloway hesitated. "Not definitively, but the software used is only accessible to law enforcement. It narrows the list of suspects." The noose around Trent tightened. Judge Grant knew he was treading on dangerous ground. Trent's connections ran deep, and exposing the truth could bring severe repercussions. But the weight of Marcus's unjust sentence loomed over him. He couldn't ignore it. Grant filed a motion to reopen the case, citing new evidence of police misconduct and tampered evidence. The legal community erupted in shock, with some praising his courage and others accusing him of undermining the system. As the motion moved forward, Grant found himself under increasing pressure. Anonymous threats arrived in his mailbox. His colleagues distanced themselves, and the media painted him as a rogue judge. But his determination only grew stronger. For Marcus Tillman, Grant knew, this was more than a case. It was a fight for his life. And for Grant, it was a battle to restore his faith in justice. The shadows of corruption loomed large, but the light of truth was beginning to break through. The whisper of truth. The motion to reopen Marcus Tillman's case sent ripples through the justice system. Judge Grant found himself standing at the center of a storm he had unleashed, but the consequences went far beyond what he had anticipated. Threats became more direct. Phone calls in the dead of night became a chilling routine, and his reputation, once sterling, now teetered on the brink of destruction. But Judge Grant was not a man easily intimidated. As he sifted through the layers of deception, he began to notice a pattern in the cases tied to Detective Trent. It wasn't just Marcus Tillman. Over a dozen convictions carried Trent's fingerprints, cases where evidence conveniently aligned too perfectly, and defendants lacked the resources to fight back. Each name on that list became a rallying cry for Grant, a reminder that his fight was about more than one man. It was about a system designed to crush those without power. The meeting in the shadows. One evening, as the December chill seeped into the city, Grant received a cryptic email. It read, "If you want the truth, meet me at the corner of 4th and Elm. Midnight. Come alone." Grant stared at the screen, his gut telling him it was a trap, but he also knew he couldn't afford to ignore it. He arrived at the meeting spot under a flickering streetlight, his coat pulled tightly around him. The street was deserted, save for the faint hum of a passing car. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, her face obscured by a scarf and hood. Her voice was low, trembling with urgency. "You don't know me, but I know Trent. He's dirty, always has been." "Who are you?" Grant asked, his voice steady but probing. "Someone who used to work with him," she replied. "Call me Lisa. That's all you need to know. I came across something years ago, and I tried to report it. But Trent, he made sure I stayed quiet." Lisa handed him a flash drive. "This has emails, reports, things I copied before I left. It's not enough to bury him, but it'll point you in the right direction. Just be careful. He won't stop at threats." Grant watched her disappear into the night, clutching the drive like it was a lifeline. The digital puzzle. Back in his study, Grant plugged the drive into his laptop. The files were a treasure trove of damning evidence, emails between Trent and higher-ups discussing fabricated charges, photos of planted evidence, and a ledger that hinted at bribes taken to ensure convictions. One email caught his attention. It was from Trent to an assistant district attorney, dated a week before Marcus's arrest. The subject line read, "Need this one nailed down. The body was worse. Ensure everything lines up. Use the gun from the Rodriguez bust if you have to. This needs to stick." Grant felt his stomach churn. The pieces were falling into place. The gun planted in Marcus's apartment wasn't just an oversight, it was part of a calculated effort to frame him. He forwarded the files to Susan Avery with a simple note, "We have what we need." Avery's resurgence. Susan Avery had been beaten down during Marcus's trial, but this time she was armed with more than just the truth. She was angry. She pored over the evidence, building the case that would dismantle the prosecution's narrative piece by piece. At a press conference, she stood before a crowd of reporters, her voice steady and defiant. "We have uncovered a pattern of corruption within the law enforcement and judicial system," she declared. "This is not just about Marcus Tillman. This is about the systemic abuse of power that has ruined countless lives." Her words sent shockwaves through the city. Public opinion began to shift, and calls for an independent investigation into Detective Trent grew louder. The pushback. But Trent wasn't about to go down without a fight. He appeared on local news, painting himself as a scapegoat. "This is a coordinated attack," he told the reporter, his face a mask of indignation. "Judge Grant and Susan Avery are trying to rewrite history to cover their own failures. I've served this city with honor for 2 decades. These accusations are baseless." The interview only fueled Grant's determination. The lies were bold, but the truth was sharper. A new ally. Amid the chaos, an unexpected ally came forward. Detective Daniel Pierce, a former partner of Trent's. Pierce, retired and disillusioned, reached out to Grant with a confession. "I turned a blind eye for years," Pierce admitted during a private meeting. "Trent was untouchable. He made sure of that. But I can't live with the guilt anymore. I know things that could help your case." Pierce provided testimony about Trent's tactics, intimidating witnesses, planting evidence, and falsifying reports. He also revealed that Trent had connections to a network of corrupt officials, all of whom benefited from high conviction rates. "Taking him down won't be easy," Pierce warned. "He's protected. But if you keep digging, you'll find the cracks." The moment of reckoning. With Avery and Pierce by his side, Grant prepared for the reopened hearing. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere electric with tension. The prosecution, now under a microscope, struggled to maintain their composure as Avery laid out the new evidence. Piece by piece, she dismantled the case against Marcus, exposing the corruption that had led to his conviction. The surveillance footage, the planted gun, the coerced witnesses, it all painted a damning picture. Grant watched as the presiding judge, a colleague he had once respected, struggled to contain his shock. The gavel struck the bench, signaling a recess. Outside, the media buzzed with questions and speculation. As Grant stood on the courthouse steps, watching the chaos unfold, he felt a rare sense of clarity. The fight was far from over, but the truth was no longer a whisper in the shadows. It was roaring into the light. The walls come crashing down. The reopened hearing in the Marcus Tillman case turned into a spectacle far beyond what Judge Grant had envisioned. What began as an effort to revisit a single conviction spiraled into an exposure of systemic corruption that reached every corner of the city's justice system. The courthouse became the epicenter of a storm. Protests filled the streets, reporters crowded the steps, and whispers of betrayal spread through the corridors of power. For Marcus Tillman, hope flickered faintly on the horizon, but the road to justice was far from clear. The testimony that broke the silence. Detective Daniel Pierce, the former partner of Harvey Trent, took the stand. His appearance was a surprise, orchestrated by Susan Avery, who had kept his involvement secret until the last moment. Pierce's testimony was explosive, recounting years of misconduct and corruption that directly implicated Trent. Trent had a saying. Pierce began, his voice steady but strained. "If the evidence doesn't fit, make it fit." I watched him plant evidence, intimidate witnesses, and falsify reports. I didn't speak up because I was scared, but I can't stay silent anymore. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously as Pierce detailed specific instances where Trent manipulated cases to secure convictions. He confirmed that the gun tied to Marcus Tillman's case had been taken from another investigation and planted in Marcus's apartment. The prosecution tried to discredit Pierce, painting him as a bitter, retired cop looking for revenge. But Avery countered with undeniable evidence from the flash drive Judge Grant had obtained. The emails, the falsified reports, and the tampered surveillance footage, all of it painted a damning picture of a man who had weaponized his badge. Marcus Tillman speaks. When Marcus was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Months of imprisonment had taken a toll on him. His frame was leaner, his face more lined, but his voice carried the same quiet strength it had on the day he was sentenced. "I didn't kill anyone," Marcus began, his hands gripping the stand. "I was at work that day, like I said from the start. But no one believed me because the system didn't care about the truth. It cared about closing the case." He paused, his eyes scanning the courtroom, lingering on Judge Grant. "I lost everything because people like Detective Trent decided my life didn't matter. But I'm still here, and I won't stop fighting." Marcus's testimony was raw and emotional, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated lies that had framed him. His words resonated deeply, even with those who had initially believed in his guilt. For the first time, Marcus wasn't just a defendant. He was a human being, a victim of a system that had failed him. The media frenzy. Outside the courtroom, the city was on fire, not with literal flames, but with the rage and passion of a community demanding accountability. Protesters carried signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "End corruption now." Local news stations aired round-the-clock coverage, and national outlets began picking up the story. Judge Grant became a reluctant symbol of reform. Journalists clamored for interviews, activists praised his courage, and critics accused him of trying to rewrite his own legacy. The pressure was immense, but Grant remained focused on the task at hand. "This isn't about me," he told a reporter during a brief interview. "This is about ensuring that the truth comes to light and that no one else suffers the way Marcus has." The investigation widens. The revelations in Marcus's case prompted a broader investigation into the Fresno Police Department. The Department of Justice sent a team of federal agents to comb through years of records, looking for patterns of misconduct. What they found was staggering. Dozens of cases bore the same hallmarks as Marcus: planted evidence, coerced confessions, and fabricated reports. Trent was not an anomaly. He was part of a larger network of officers who prioritized convictions over justice. The investigation uncovered connections to prosecutors, judges, and even local politicians who had benefited from the high conviction rates. Trent's arrest was imminent, but he remained defiant. From his lawyer's office, he issued a statement calling the investigation a witch hunt and accusing Judge Grant and Susan Avery of orchestrating a personal vendetta. "They're tearing apart a system that works," Trent declared. "I've spent my career protecting this city, and this is the thanks I get." A moment of reflection. Amid the chaos, Judge Grant found himself alone in his chambers late one evening. His desk was littered with files, but his mind drifted to the weight of his actions. He had spent decades upholding the law, believing in its integrity. Now he was confronted with its fragility. Had he been blind all these years? How many others like Marcus had he condemned without knowing the full truth? The door creaked open, and Susan Avery stepped inside. She looked as exhausted as he felt, but her expression was one of quiet determination. "You're doing the right thing," she said, as if sensing his doubt. "Am I?" Grant asked, his voice heavy. "I put Marcus in that cell. I trusted the system, and I failed him." Avery sat down across from him. "You didn't fail him, Judge. The system did. And now you're helping to fix it. That matters." Grant nodded, but the guilt lingered. Redemption was a long road, and he wasn't sure he'd ever reach the end. The climax. As the hearing resumed, the final piece of evidence was presented: security footage recovered from a nearby ATM on the day of the murders. It showed Marcus Tillman clocking into work at the diner miles away from the crime scene, just minutes before the robbery occurred. The timestamp was irrefutable. The prosecution had no response. The evidence, combined with Pierce's testimony and the revelations of police misconduct, shattered their case. The judge overseeing the hearing declared Marcus's conviction overturned. The gallery erupted in applause, and Marcus's mother wept openly, clutching her son as he was freed from his shackles. For Marcus, it was the end of one battle and the beginning of another. He vowed to dedicate his life to fighting for others who had been wrongfully convicted, turning his pain into purpose. The fallout. Detective Trent was arrested on charges of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and perjury. His trial promised to be a high-profile affair, but the damage to his reputation was irreversible. The investigation into the police department led to multiple resignations, firings, and criminal charges. Judge Grant, though hailed as a hero by many, faced his own reckoning. He announced his retirement shortly after the case, choosing to step away from the bench to focus on advocacy work for judicial reform. His journey wasn't over, but it had taken a new direction, one driven by a desire to make amends. The Marcus Tillman case became a landmark moment in the fight for justice, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged when the truth refused to stay hidden. And though the scars remained, Marcus walked out of that courtroom a free man, his head held high. The walls of corruption had come crashing down, and in their place, hope began to take root. A system on trial. Marcus Tillman was free, but the battle was far from over. His release, while a victory, was only the first step in dismantling a corrupt system that had nearly destroyed him. The fallout from his overturned conviction sent shockwaves across the nation. Local and federal authorities began a full-scale investigation into the Fresno Police Department, the district attorney's office, and even Judge Nathaniel Grant's courtroom decisions. The story had grown beyond Marcus. It had become a reckoning for the justice system itself. For Marcus, freedom brought its own challenges. His years behind bars had left deep scars, and the world outside felt unfamiliar and overwhelming. He was hailed as a symbol of resilience, But behind closed doors, he wrestled with the trauma of wrongful imprisonment. His mother, Gloria, did her best to shield him from the media frenzy, but Marcus knew he couldn't stay silent. The fight wasn't just about his freedom. It was about the countless others still trapped in the system. The trial of Detective Harvey Trent. Detective Harvey Trent's trial began with the city watching intently. The charges against him included evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, perjury, and conspiracy. For years, Trent had operated with impunity, but now the walls were closing in. His once confident demeanor had eroded, replaced by visible tension as he faced the full weight of the law. The prosecution, led by a federal attorney unafraid of Trent's connections, laid out a damning case. They presented emails, falsified reports, and testimony from Detective Daniel Pierce, who had once been Trent's partner and ally. Pierce's testimony was particularly devastating. On the stand, he described the culture of corruption that had flourished under Trent's leadership. Trent didn't just bend the rules. He broke them every chance he got, Pierce said, his voice steady. He taught us that convictions were more important than the truth, that the ends justified the means. But that was a lie, and it cost innocent people their freedom. Trent's defense team tried to paint him as a scapegoat, arguing that he was a victim of a politically motivated witch hunt. They pointed to his decades of service and his success in solving high-profile cases. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The most damning moment came when the prosecution played surveillance footage of Trent leaving the evidence locker with the gun that had been planted in Marcus Tillman's apartment. The room fell silent as the grainy video played, showing Trent's unmistakable figure and the timestamp proving his guilt. Marcus's voice. While Trent's trial unfolded, Marcus began speaking publicly about his experiences. His first major interview aired on national television, where he sat across from a respected journalist who had followed his case closely. "I lost 3 years of my life," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I lost time with my family, my friends, my dreams. But what I've gained is a purpose. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." The interview was raw and emotional, with Marcus recounting the moment he was sentenced, the despair of prison life, and the hope he clung to despite everything. Viewers across the country were moved by his story, and his words ignited a broader conversation about systemic injustice. Organizations advocating for criminal justice reform reached out to Marcus, offering him platforms to share his story. He began working with groups dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions, using his newfound voice to fight for those still silenced. The domino effect. The investigation into Detective Trent's actions revealed a web of corruption far larger than anyone had anticipated. Officers who had once worked under Trent came forward, some confessing their own involvement, while others provided testimony against him. It became clear that Trent was not acting alone. He was part of a network that included other officers, prosecutors, and even local politicians. The district attorney who had prosecuted Marcus's case was forced to resign after it was revealed that she had ignored evidence of Marcus's innocence to secure a conviction. Several other high-ranking officials faced similar consequences, and the Department of Justice began a sweeping review of past convictions handled by Trent and his network. The city of Fresno became a case study in corruption, with media outlets nationwide reporting on the systemic failures that had allowed such abuses to thrive. Protests continued, demanding accountability and transparency in law enforcement and the judiciary. Judge Grant's redemption. Judge Nathaniel Grant, once revered and later vilified, found himself in an unusual position. He was neither celebrated as a hero nor condemned as a villain, but rather scrutinized as a symbol of the justice system's contradictions. His role in sentencing Marcus Tillman had been a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for Grant himself. Grant stepped down from the bench shortly after Marcus's release, choosing to dedicate his time to advocacy work. He joined forces with Marcus and Susan Avery, lending his voice and experience to the movement for judicial reform. In his first public speech since retiring, Grant addressed a packed auditorium at a justice reform summit. "I spent decades believing in the infallibility of the law," he began. "But the Marcus Tillman case forced me to confront a painful truth. Our system is not perfect, and it is not always just. We must hold ourselves accountable, not just for our actions, but for our inactions. Justice isn't static. It requires vigilance, courage, and humility." His words were met with a standing ovation, but Grant knew his journey of redemption was far from over. He had been part of the problem, and now he was determined to be part of the solution. A new beginning. As Trent's trial reached its conclusion, the jury delivered a verdict that sent a clear message: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in relief and satisfaction as Trent was led away in handcuffs, his reign of corruption finally at an end. For Marcus, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars of his ordeal remained. He returned to his mother's modest home, where he found solace in family and community. But he also found purpose in his newfound role as an advocate and activist. Marcus established the Tillman Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted individuals and their families. The foundation provided legal aid, emotional support, and resources for reintegration into society. It became a beacon of hope for those who had been forgotten by the system. The bigger picture. The ripple effects of Marcus Tillman's case continued to spread. Laws were passed to increase oversight of law enforcement and prosecutors. Training programs emphasized ethics and accountability. And a new generation of public defenders, inspired by Susan Avery's tireless fight, entered the field with renewed determination. For Marcus, his journey was far from over. He had lost time, but he had gained a voice, and he intended to use it to fight for those still trapped in the darkness of injustice. His story, and the courage of those who stood by him, became a testament to the power of truth, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. The system had been shaken to its core, but the fight to rebuild it had only just begun. Beyond redemption. The Marcus Tillman case became a touchstone for justice reform, but the battle was far from over. For every Marcus who walked free, there were countless others still languishing in cells, their lives stolen by a system that had failed them. Marcus's freedom was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a broader movement to dismantle corruption, rebuild trust, and redefine justice. The road to recovery. Freedom came with its own burdens. Marcus Tillman had spent 3 years in prison, where time had stretched and warped under the weight of isolation and injustice. On his first day out, he found himself overwhelmed by the simplest things: people rushing down busy sidewalks, cars honking in chaotic streets, and the cold indifference of a world that had moved on without him. His mother, Gloria, did her best to ease his transition. She cooked his favorite meals, filled their modest home with warmth, and shielded him from the prying eyes of reporters who camped outside their door. But even her love couldn't erase the invisible scars. "I'm not the same person I was," Marcus admitted one evening, his voice heavy with emotion. "They took so much from me." Gloria reached across the table, taking his hand. "They didn't take your spirit, Marcus. You're still here, and you have a chance to make a difference." Her words stayed with him, planting a seed of purpose that would grow in the weeks to come. The Tillman Foundation. The first major step Marcus took toward healing was turning his pain into action. With the help of Susan Avery, Judge Grant, and a coalition of activists, he established the Tillman Foundation, dedicated to supporting individuals wrongfully convicted and advocating for systemic reform. The foundation quickly gained traction, attracting donations from across the country. It provided legal aid to those fighting to prove their innocence, offered counseling for families torn apart by wrongful convictions, and launched public awareness campaigns to highlight the flaws in the justice system. Marcus personally led workshops in schools and community centers, sharing his story with young people. He wanted them to understand the importance of standing up for what was right and questioning systems that seemed unshakable. During one of these workshops, a young boy asked him, "Mr. Tillman, how did you keep going when everyone thought you were guilty?" Marcus knelt to meet the boy's gaze. Because I knew the truth, and I believed that one day someone else would see it too. Never let anyone take away your truth. Judge Grant's legacy. After retiring from the bench, Judge Nathaniel Grant dedicated his life to advocating for justice reform. He became a regular speaker at legal conferences, universities, and advocacy events, using his platform to push for accountability within the judiciary. Grant's newfound role came with its own challenges. Critics accused him of grandstanding, claiming that his shift to reform advocacy was a way to cleanse his tarnished reputation. But Grant accepted the criticism, knowing that his past decisions would always haunt him. One day, while addressing a group of young law students, he paused mid-speech, his voice catching. "I spent years believing that the law was infallible, that it was a shield against injustice. But I learned, painfully, that the law is only as just as the people who uphold it. It's our responsibility to make it better." His words resonated deeply, inspiring many of the students to pursue careers in public defense, civil rights law, and social justice. The national movement. The fallout from Marcus Tillman's case extended far beyond Fresno. The Department of Justice launched a nationwide review of wrongful convictions, focusing on cases with evidence of police misconduct or prosecutorial overreach. What they uncovered was staggering: a pattern of corruption and negligence that had stolen freedom from thousands of innocent people. In response, Congress passed the Justice Accountability Act, which established independent oversight committees to review criminal cases and investigate claims of misconduct. The act also provided funding for public defenders, ensuring that no defendant would be left without adequate representation. Marcus was invited to testify before Congress during the drafting of the act. Standing before lawmakers, he recounted his ordeal with unwavering clarity. "I am not here because of what happened to me," Marcus said. "I am here because what happened to me is still happening to others. This is not about one case. It's about a system that prioritizes convictions over truth. We have the power to change that, and we must." Harvey Trent's reckoning. Detective Harvey Trent's trial ended with a guilty verdict on all counts. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, a far cry from the decades he had stolen from others. Trent's fall from grace sent a clear message to law enforcement: corruption would no longer be tolerated. But Trent's conviction was not the end of the story. The investigation into his network revealed layers of complicity, with dozens of officers, prosecutors, and even local politicians implicated in similar schemes. Many resigned or were removed from office, while others faced their own trials. The Fresno Police Department underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership and strict oversight to ensure transparency and accountability. But the road to rebuilding trust was long, and the scars of corruption lingered. Marcus's quiet triumph. As the years passed, Marcus found a sense of peace in his work. The Tillman Foundation grew into a national organization, freeing dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals and reuniting them with their families. Each victory brought a bittersweet reminder of the time he had lost, but it also reaffirmed his belief in the power of resilience. One evening, Marcus stood on the steps of the courthouse where his life had been shattered and rebuilt. He looked out at the crowd gathered for a candlelight vigil honoring those who had been wrongfully convicted. As the soft glow of candles illuminated the faces around him, Marcus felt a profound sense of purpose. "This is not just about justice," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of the crowd. "It's about humanity. It's about believing that every life has value, and that every person deserves the truth." The lasting impact. The Marcus Tillman case became a symbol of hope and a rallying cry for change. It reminded the world that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged, that the truth could prevail against overwhelming odds, and that redemption was always possible. For Marcus, his mother, Judge Grant, and Susan Avery, the journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. Together, they proved that justice wasn't just an abstract ideal, it was a fight worth waging, no matter the cost. And as the first light of dawn broke over the city, Marcus Tillman stood tall, ready to continue the fight. A new dawn. The courthouse steps grew quiet as Marcus Tillman finished his speech, his words hanging in the air like a solemn vow. The crowd, a sea of faces illuminated by candlelight, stood in silence before erupting into applause. For Marcus, this moment wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been failed by the system and those who refused to accept its injustices. A reunion and reflection. After the vigil, Marcus sat with his mother, Gloria, in their modest living room. The warm glow of a single lamp cast shadows on the walls, creating an intimate cocoon of comfort. Gloria, ever the quiet pillar of strength, poured them each a cup of tea. "You've done so much, Marcus," she said, her voice full of pride. "But I know it hasn't been easy." Marcus nodded, staring into his tea. "Sometimes I wonder if it's enough. For every person we help, there are so many more still out there, still waiting." Gloria reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "You're making a difference, baby. That's more than most people can say." Marcus smiled faintly. "I just wish Dad were here to see this." Gloria's eyes glistened. "He'd be so proud of you. I know he's watching over us." The weight of her words settled over them like a comforting blanket, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus allowed himself to feel the peace he had fought so hard to find. A legacy of justice. As the Tillman Foundation expanded, Marcus became a symbol of hope and determination. He traveled the country, meeting with lawmakers, activists, and communities impacted by wrongful convictions. His story inspired documentaries, books, and even a film, all of which brought more attention to the need for justice reform. Susan Avery, who had stood by Marcus through his darkest days, became a leading voice in the movement. She left her small public defense office to join the foundation full-time, heading its legal team. Together, she and Marcus worked tirelessly to overturn wrongful convictions, each victory reinforcing their shared belief in the power of truth. Judge Nathaniel Grant, though retired, remained a staunch advocate for change. His work with the foundation brought much-needed credibility to their cause, and his lectures on judicial reform became must-see events for law students and professionals alike. A visit to the past. One quiet afternoon, Marcus returned to the prison where he had spent 3 years of his life. The visit wasn't easy, but he felt it was necessary. He walked through the gates, past the guards who now recognized him as a free man, not an inmate. Inside, he met with a group of prisoners who had written to him, sharing their own stories of injustice. One man, an older inmate named Carl, stood and spoke. "You give us hope, Marcus. You made it out, and you're fighting for people like us. That means more than you'll ever know." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. "You're not forgotten," he said. "We're fighting for all of you, and we won't stop." As he left the prison, Marcus glanced back at the imposing walls that had once confined him. They no longer felt like a symbol of his pain, but a reminder of the fight he was destined to continue. A final reckoning. The reforms sparked by Marcus's case culminated in a landmark Supreme Court ruling that set new standards for evidence handling, witness protection, and the oversight of law enforcement. The decision was hailed as a turning point in American justice, a direct result of the momentum generated by Marcus's fight. Detective Harvey Trent, now serving his sentence, became a cautionary tale, a stark warning of what happens when those in power abuse their authority. His conviction sent a ripple effect through law enforcement agencies nationwide, prompting widespread reforms and increased accountability. A new chapter. Years later, Marcus stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Tillman Center for Justice and Advocacy, a state-of-the-art facility that housed legal clinics, support services, and a public archive of wrongful convictions. The center was a culmination of his efforts and the support of countless people who believed in his cause. As he addressed the crowd, Marcus's voice carried the strength of someone who had not just survived but thrived. "This center is not just a building," he said. "It's a promise that we will never stop fighting for justice, for truth, and for every person who deserves to be seen and heard. Together, we are creating a system that values humanity over expedience, compassion over corruption, and justice over everything. The crowd erupted into applause as Marcus cut the ribbon, symbolizing the start of a new chapter not just for him, but for the countless lives the center would touch. Epilogue. In the years that followed, the Tillman Foundation and the justice reform movement grew into a force that transformed the landscape of American law. Marcus's story became a beacon of hope, reminding the world that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. As Marcus walked through the halls of the Tillman Center, his mother by his side, he paused to look at a wall adorned with the names of individuals the foundation had helped free. He ran his fingers over the engraved letters, a solemn reminder of the lives that had been reclaimed. Gloria smiled at him. "You've built something incredible, Marcus. Your father would be so proud." Marcus nodded, his heart full. "This isn't just for me, Mom. It's for everyone who believed in me when I didn't think I could keep going. It's for the people still waiting, and it's for the future." As they stepped outside into the sunlight, Marcus felt the weight of his past lift, replaced by the limitless possibilities of what lay ahead. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he truly believed they were winning. Justice, though delayed, was finally finding its way.